Greetings and salutations. Can you hear me? Can you see us? Greetings and salutations. There's my echo. Yeah. All right. All right. I see Mr. Sam Mikulich is here. Awesome. Hello, Christina. Kathy B. Yes, cut the raven locks and the brown ones as well. Hello, Miss Kelsey Blaine Gibson. Kathy. Meg Sampson. My mom is here. Hello, Dari. Angelica. Miss Patty Pinkstaff. All right. Roberta Acuna is here. Anna, hello. And yes, greetings to all of the sexy disciples. Hi, Svetlana. Drinking out of... I love this coffee cup that Svetlana sent us. I'm going to dive right in here. Hello, Amanda Benjamin. Emily Thatcher. Don Emery. Oh, Don, we've got to catch up and we got to schedule a show. Or should I contact Julie for the details? Who does the coordination of times and dates and details? I need to talk to one or both of you in any case. Let's get that thing on the calendars. Looking forward to that. That's man, really looking forward to that. Speaking of things I'm looking forward to, next week I am 80 to 90% sure next week that we're going to skip next week on the holiday, and the next Fireside Tales with Wolfgang will be 2 weeks from tonight. A bunch of regular viewers are going to be doing holiday stuff, and I found out this afternoon that one of my very old, longtime close friends and business partners is moving with his family to Texas at the beginning of June. So I'm going to cruise down the mountain and see all of them for a big send-off. Yes, my stylist rocks indeed. Again, thank you, Christina, for a shave and a haircut. So, we're going to jump right into the next few pages from Walden. And tonight's short story that will follow Walden will be slightly longer than average. We're not going to go hugely, way grandiosely past 10 o'clock because at 10:30 there is another installment of Moody Mondays on the Vaudacity network. And I have an open invitation to jump in to that show, and yeah, I think I will. Olive keeps staring at my haircut. That's adorable. That's really cute. All right, this is the next section from Walden, where I lived and what I lived for. Every morning was a cheerful invitation to make my life of equal simplicity, and I might say innocence, with nature herself. I have been as sincere a worshiper of Aurora as the Greeks. I got up early and bathed in the pond. That was a religious exercise and one of the best things which I did. They say that characters were engraven on the bathing tub of King Ching Thang to this effect. The inscription read, "Renew thyself completely each day. Do it again, and forever again." I can understand that. Morning brings back the heroic ages. I was as much affected by the faint hum of a mosquito making its invisible and unimaginable tour through my apartment at earliest dawn when I was sitting with door and windows open as I could be by any trumpet that ever sang of fame. It was Homer's Requiem, itself an Iliad and Odyssey in the air, singing its own wrath and wanderings. There was something cosmical about it, a standing advertisement, till forbidden, of the everlasting vigor and fertility of the world. The morning, which is the most memorable season of the day, is the awakening hour. Then there is at least somnolescence in us, and for an hour at least some part of us awakes which slumbers all the rest of the day and night. Little is to be expected of that day, if it can be called a day, to which we are not awakened by our genius, but by the mechanical nudgings of some servitor, like an alarm clock, are not awakened by our own newly acquired force and aspirations from within, accompanied by the undulations of celestial music instead of factory bells, and a fragrance filling the air to a higher life than we fell asleep from, and thus the darkness bear its fruit and prove itself to be good no less than the light. That man who does not believe that each day contains an earlier, more sacred and auroral hour than he has yet profaned has despaired of life and is pursuing a descending and darkening way. After a partial cessation of his sensuous life, the soul of man, or its organs rather, are reinvigorated every day, and his genius tries again what noble life it can make. All memorable events, I should say, transpire in the morning time and in a morning atmosphere. The Vedas say, all intelligences awake with the morning. Poetry and art, and the fairest and most memorable of the actions of men date from such an hour. All poets and heroes, like Memnon, are the children of Aurora and emit their music at sunrise. To him whose elastic and vigorous thought keeps pace with the sun, the day is a perpetual morning. It matters not what the clocks say or the attitudes and labors of men. Morning is when I am awake and there is a dawn in me. Moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. Why is it that men give so poor an account of their day if they have not been slumbering? They're not such poor calculators. If they had not been overcome with drowsiness, they would have performed something. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. only 1 in 100 million to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. I have never yet met a man who was quite awake. How could I have looked him in the face? We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture, or to carve a statue, and so to make a few objects beautiful. But it is far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. Every man is tasked to make his life, even in its details, worthy of the contemplation of his most elevated and critical hour. If we refused, or rather used up such paltry information as we get, the oracles would distinctly inform us how this might be done. This is one of my this is one of my favorite sections of this entire thing. In my entire life, these are the words. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. To live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it into its lowest terms, and if it proved to be mean, why, then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience and be able to give a true account in my next excursion. Still, we live meanly, like ants. Though the fable tells us that we were long ago changed into men, like pygmies we fight with cranes. It is error upon error, and clout upon clout. And our best virtue has for its occasion a superfluous and evitable wretchedness. Our life is frittered away by detail. An honest man has hardly need to count more than his 10 fingers, or in extreme cases, he may add his 10 toes and lump the rest. Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. I say, let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail. In the midst of this chopping sea of civilized life, such are the clouds and storms and quicksands and 1,001 items to be allowed for that a man has to live. If he would not founder and go to the bottom and not make his port at all by dead reckoning, and he must be a great calculator indeed who succeeds. Simplify. Instead of 3 meals a day, if it be necessary, eat but 1. Instead of 100 dishes, 5. And reduce other things in proportion. Men think that it is essential that the nation have commerce and export ice and talk through a telegraph and ride 30 miles an hour, without a doubt, whether they do or not. But whether we should live like baboons or like men is a little uncertain. If we do not get out sleepers and forge rails and devote days and nights to the work, but go to tinkering upon our lives to improve them, who will build railroads? And if railroads are not built, how shall we get to heaven in season? But if we stay at home and mind our business, who will want railroads? We do not ride on the railroad. It rides upon us. I'm glad to know that it takes a gang of men for every 5 miles to keep the sleepers down and level in their beds as it is. For this is a sign that they may sometime get up again. Why should we live with such hurry and waste of life? We are determined to be starved before we are hungry. Men say that a stitch in time saves 9, and so they take 1,000 stitches today to save 9 tomorrow. As for work, we haven't any of any consequence. Wow. And he wrote that over 100 years before Instagram. How many of you know that thing where you sit down to do one thing on Instagram, like, I'm going to do this post, or I'm just going to check this one DM, or I'm just going to, and then like, it's 20 minutes later. How have I still not done the one thing that I sat down to? How did I get lost in the minutia of Instagram, right? It's holy haircut, Batman. Yeah. And I love how true everything Henry David Thoreau has to say there. And yet it applies to absurdly antiquated things, but it's still true. And the big, like men are rushing around to travel at 30 miles an hour because, you know, that's as fast as you can really push a horse, and not for very long, by the way. But like, how miserable are you if you can't drive faster than 30 miles an hour? Because I got to get to work and that's first. Yeah, right. And then suddenly you know everything about cryptocurrency. I don't really know anybody that claims to know anything about cryptocurrency. Funny thing about that. I don't know, man, but that seems to work and my numbers just keep going up. Yeah, well. I don't know. Yeah, so I have a twitchy beast here. Gonna jump right into this evening's story. Going to one more time plug the Moody Mondays show that's going to happen at 10:30 after this show on the Vaudacity Network. And also to say that 90% sure there's going to be no show next week. The next Fireside Tales with Wolfgang will be 2 weeks from now. Always, of course, keep an eye on Instagram, Facebook, all those things for any last-second improv show. Tonight's short story is by a man who wrote under the name Professor Lewis Hoffman. Poor Lewis Hoffman didn't get to see the roaring 20s. He died in 1919, but he was born with the name Angelo John Lewis in England. He was a lawyer. He was a professor. Interestingly enough, he was the leading writer on magic, games, amusements, and puzzles of his time. So, like, this would have been a really interesting nerd that you would definitely want to attend your Dungeons & Dragons game. He wrote a series of articles on magic for a boys' magazine. It was called Every Boys Annual. And that series of articles was later expanded into a book that he published called Modern Magic. Funny enough, his pen name, Professor Hoffman, was used because he feared that his professional prospects as a lawyer would be injured if it became known that he possessed such an intimate knowledge of the arts of deception. Personally, I think that's hysterical. Like, don't you hire lawyers because of their talent in twisting reality into your favor? Isn't that exactly what motivates you to call that particular lawyer? I'm fascinated. Sometimes I'm just fascinated by how lawyers see themselves. I dated a lawyer once, quite a while ago now, but ironically, we broke up in no small part because she paid me this extremely profound compliment. She said, "You're the only guy I have ever dated who can successfully argue me to a standstill." Now, on the one hand, like in one ear, I'm hearing, "Oh, she appreciates my intelligence. How flattering." On the other ear, I'm hearing, her favorite thing that we do together is fight. This sucks. I'm out. I'm done. But the relevant bit was that I would every now and then make lawyer jokes, and she would just, profoundly offended about anything that would make any implications to a lack of ethics on her behalf, because being a lawyer, you are sworn up one side and down the other to very strict ethical promises, let's just say, in how you comport yourself in your day-to-day business practices. But ambulance chasers make all these same promises. So I just thought that was the funniest thing, that she thought she was like the height of trustworthy because she's a lawyer, and I viewed her as exactly the opposite. Yeah, never mind that she also slept with a cocked and loaded .45 under her pillow with the safety off. Never rested too comfortably there. So, enough about lawyers. Please insert your favorite lawyer joke in the chat now. I know you know at least 3 of them. All right. This is The Wrong Black Bag by Angelo Lewis, penned and published under the name Professor Lewis Hoffman. It was the eve of Good Friday. Within the modest parlor of number 13 Primrose Terrace, a little man wearing a gray felt hat and a red necktie stood admiring himself in the looking glass over the mantelpiece. Such a state of things anywhere else would have had no significance whatever, but circumstances proverbially alter cases. At 13 Primrose Terrace, it approached the dimensions of a portent. Not to keep the listener in suspense, the little man was Benjamin Quelch, clerk in the office of Messrs. Cobble and Clink, coal merchants, and he was about to carry out a desperate resolution. Most men have some secret ambition. Benjamin's was twofold. For years, he had yearned to wear a soft felt hat and make a trip to Paris. And for years, fate, in the person of Mrs. Quelch, had stood in the way and prevented the indulgence of his longing. Quelch being, as we have hinted, exceptionally small of stature, had, in accordance with the mysterious law of opposites, selected the largest lady of his acquaintance as the partner of his joys. He himself was of a meek and retiring disposition. Mrs. Quelch, on the other hand, was a woman of stern and decided temperament, with strong views upon most subjects. She administered Benjamin's finances. She regulated his diet, prescribed for him when his health was out of order. Though fond of him in her own way, she ruled him with a rod of iron, and on 3 points she was inflexible. To make up for his insignificance of stature, she insisted on his wearing the tallest hat that money could procure, to the exclusion of all other headgear. Secondly, on the ground that it looked more professional, she would allow him none but black silk neckties. I really hate to hear what she thought of plaid flannel shirts and cats. And lastly, she would not let him smoke. She had further an intense repugnance to all things foreign, holding as an article of faith that no good thing, whether in art, cookery, or morals, was to be found on other than English soil. When Benjamin once, in a rash moment, suggested a trip to Bologna by way of a summer holiday, the suggestion was received in a manner that took away his appetite for a week afterward. As for the wife's prohibition of smoking, Quelch did not much mind, for having in his salad days made a trial of a cheap cigar, the result somehow satisfied him that tobacco was not in his line, and he ceased to yearn for it accordingly. But the tall hat and the black necktie were constant sources of irritation. He had an idea, based on his having once won a drawing prize at school, that nature had intended for him an artist, and he secretly lamented the untoward fate which had thrown him away upon coals. Now, the few artists Benjamin had chanced to meet frequently affected a soft and slouchy style of headgear, and a considerable amount of freedom, generally with a touch of color, in the region of the neck. Such, therefore, in the fitness of things, should have been the hat, and such the neck gear of Benjamin Quelch, and the veto of his wife only made him yearn for those things the more intensely. In later years, he had been seized with a longing to see Paris. It chanced that a clerk in the same office, one Peter Flip, had made a visit to the gay city. The gay city, again, is Paris, not San Francisco. The cost of the trip had been but 5 guineas, but never, surely, were 5 guineas so magnificently invested. There was a good deal of romance about Flip, and it may be that his accounts were not entirely trustworthy, but they so fired the imagination of our friend Benjamin that he had at once begun to hoard up surreptitious sixpences, with the hope that someday he too might, by for some unforeseen combination of circumstances, be enabled to visit that enchanted city of lights. And at last, that day had come. Mrs. Quelch, for her 3 children and her 1 domestic servant, had gone to Lowestoft for an Easter outing, and Benjamin and deaf chairwoman, Miss Widger, were left in charge of the family belongings. Benjamin's Easter holidays were limited to Good Friday and Easter Monday, and as it seemed hardly worthwhile that he should travel so far as Lowestoft for such short periods, Mrs. Quelch had thoughtfully arranged that he should spend the former day at the British Museum and the latter at the Zoological Gardens. 2 days after her departure, however, Mr. Cobble called Quelch into his private office and told him that if he liked, he might for once take holiday from the Friday to the Tuesday inclusive and join his wife at Seaside. Quelch accepted the boon with an honest intention of employing it as suggested. Indeed, he had even begun a letter to his wife announcing the pleasing intelligence, and had gotten as far as, "My dear Penelope," when a wild and wicked thought struck him. Why should he not spend his unexpected holiday in Paris? Laying down his pen, he opened his desk and counted his secret hoard. It amounted to £5.17, 12 shillings more than Mr. Flip's outlay. There was no difficulty in that direction, and nobody would be any the wiser. His wife would imagine that he was in London, while his employers would believe him to be at Lowestoft with his wife. There was a brief struggle in his mind, but the temper prevailed, and with a courage worthy of a better cause, he determined to risk it and go. And thus it came to pass that, on the evening of our story, Benjamin Quelch, having completed his packing, which merely comprised of what he was accustomed to call his night things, neatly bestowed in a small black handbag belonging to Mrs. Quelch, stood before the looking-glass and contemplated his guilty splendor. The red necktie and the soft gray felt hat purchased out of surplus funds. He had expended a couple of guineas in a second-class return ticket and another £2 in coupons which entitled him to bed, breakfast, and dinner for 5 days at certain specified hotels in Paris. This outlay, with half a crown for a pair of gloves and a bribe of 5 shillings to secure the silence of Mrs. Widger, left him with little more than £1 in hand, but this small surplus would no doubt amply suffice for his modest needs. His only regret, as he gazed at himself in the glass, was that he had not had the time to grow a mustache, the one thing needed to complete his artistic appearance. But time was fleeting, and he dared not linger over the enticing picture. He stole along the passage and softly opened the street door, and as he did so, a sudden panic came over him, and he felt half inclined to abandon his rash design. But as he wavered, he caught sight of the detested tall hat hanging up in the passage, and he hesitated no longer. He went out and, closing the door behind him, started at a brisk pace for Victoria Station. His plans had been laid with much ingenuity, though at a terrible sacrifice of his usual straightforwardness. He had written a couple of letters to Mrs. Quelch to be posted by the maid, Mrs. Widger, on appropriate days, giving imaginary accounts of his visits to the British Museum and Zoological Gardens, with pointed allusions to the behavior of the elephant and other circumstantial particulars. To ensure the posting of these in proper order, he had marked the dates in pencil on the envelopes in the corner usually occupied by the postage stamp, so that when the latter was affixed, the figures would be concealed. He explained the arrangement to Mrs. Widger, who promised that his instructions should be faithfully carried out. After a sharp walk, he reached the railway station, and in due course found himself steaming across the English Channel to Dieppe. The passage was not especially rough, but to poor Quelch, unaccustomed as he was to the sea, it seemed as if the boat would go to the bottom every moment. To the bodily pains of seasickness were added the mental pains of remorse, and between the two, he reached Dieppe more dead than alive. Indeed, he would almost have welcomed death as a release from his terrible sea sufferings. Even when the boat had arrived at the pier, he still remained in the berth he had occupied all night, and would probably have continued to lie there had not the steward lifted him by force to his feet. He seized his black bag with a groan and staggered on deck. Here he felt a little better, but new terrors seized him at the sight of the gold-laced officials and blue-bloused porters who lined each side of the gangway, all talking at the top of their voices and in tones which seemed, to his unaccustomed ear, to convey a thirst for British blood. No sooner had he landed than he was accosted by a ferocious-looking personage, in truth, a perfectly harmless custom house officer, who asked him in French whether he had anything to declare, and made a movement to take his bag in order to mark it as passed. Now, Quelch jumped to the conclusion that the stranger was a brigand bent on depriving him of his property, and he held onto the bag with such tenacity that the douanier naturally inferred that there was something especially contraband about this bag. So he proceeded to open it and procured among sundry other feminine belongings, a lady's frilled and fur-billowed nightdress, from which, as he unrolled it, fell a couple of bundles of cigars. Benjamin's look of astonishment as he saw these unexpected articles produced from his bag was interpreted by the officials as a look of guilt. As a matter of fact, half stupefied by the agonies of the night, he had forgotten the precise spot where he had left his own bag and had picked up in its stead one belonging to the wife of a sporting gentleman on his way to some races at Longchamp. Desiring to smuggle a few weeds. There's still just cigars here, but with trade embargoes, it's kind of as big a deal as if it were actually weed. Earmark that. Desiring to smuggle a few weeds, and deeming that the presence of such articles would be less likely to be suspected among a lady's belongings, the sporting gentleman had committed them to his companion's keeping. Handheld bags, as a rule, are typically passed unopened, and such probably would have been the case in the present instance had not Quelch's look of panic excited suspicion. The real owners of the bag had picked up Quelch's, which it precisely resembled, and were close behind him on the gangway. The lady uttered an exclamation of dismay as she saw the contents of her bag spread abroad by the customs officer, but was promptly silenced by her husband. "Right, keep your blessed tongue quiet," he whispered. "If that bloomin' idiot chooses to sneak our bag and then to give himself away to the first man that looks at him, he must stand the racket." Whereupon the sporting gentleman and lady, first taking a quiet peep into Benjamin's bag to make sure that it contained nothing compromising, passed the examiner with a smile of conscious innocence, and, after an interval for refreshment at the buffet, took their seats in the train for Paris. Meanwhile, poor Quelch was taken before a pompous individual with an extra-large mustache and a double allowance of gold lace on his cap. And poor Benjamin was charged not only with defrauding the revenue, but with forcibly resisting an officer in the execution of his duty. The accusation being in French, Quelch did not understand a word of it, and in his ignorance, took it for granted that he was accused of stealing the strange bag and its contents. Visions of imprisonment, penal servitude, don't worry, it just means jail, nay, even capital punishment, that means just killing him, floated before his bewildered brain. Finally, the official with the large mustache made a speech to him in French, setting forth that for his dishonest attempt to smuggle, he must pay a fine of 100 francs. With regard to the assault on the official, as said official was not actually hurt, he graciously agreed to throw that in and make no charge for it. How generous. When the officer had fully explained matters to his own satisfaction, he waited to receive the answer of the prisoner, but none was forthcoming, for the best of reasons. It finally dawned on the official that Quelch might not understand French, and he therefore proceeded to address him in what he considered to be his most likely native tongue. "You smuggle
you smuggle the cigar. Then it must that you pay amende. You must pay 100 francs. Do me understand? 100 francs. Pay, pay, pay. At each repetition of the last word, he brought down a dirty fist into the palm of the opposite hand, immediately under Quelch's nose. 100 francs. English money. English money, £4. Quelch caught the last words and was relieved to find that it was merely a money payment that was demanded of him. But he was little better off, for having but a few shillings in his pockets to pay. £4 was as much out of his power as if it had been 400. He determined to appeal to the mercy of his captors. "I not got," he said apologetically, with a vague idea that by speaking very elementary English, he came somehow nearer to French. "That all," he continued, producing his little store and holding it out beseechingly to the official. "Pas is not enough," growled the latter. Quelch again tried all of his pockets, but only succeeded in finding another 3-penny piece. The officer shook his head, and after a brief discussion with his fellows, said, "Monsieur, how do you call yourself?" With a vague idea of keeping his disgrace from his friends, Quelch rashly determined to give a false name. If he had a few minutes to think it over, he would have invented one for the occasion, but his imagination was not accustomed to such sudden calls, and on the question being repeated, he desperately gave the name of his next-door neighbor, Mr. Henry Fladgate. "Henri Fladgate," repeated the officer as he wrote it down. "And you live where?" And Quelch proceeded to give the address of Mr. Fladgate, 11 Primrose Terrace. "Très bien. Send telegram. I send the telegram to the jail." And poor Benjamin was shamefully marched to the local police station. Meanwhile, Quelch's arrangements at home were scarcely working as he had intended. The estimable Mrs. Widger, partly by reason of her deafness and partly of naive stupidity, had only half understood his instructions about the letters. She knew she was to stamp them, and she knew she was to post them, but the dates in the corners might as well have been runic inscriptions for any idea they conveyed to her obfuscated intellect. Accordingly, early on the morning of Good Friday, she proceeded, in her own language, to get your dratted things off her mind by dropping them both into the nearest mailbox. On the following day, therefore, Mrs. Quelch was surprised to find on the breakfast table 2 letters in her Benjamin's handwriting. Her surprise was still greater when, on opening them, she found one to be a graphic account of a visit to the zoological gardens on the following Monday. The Monday that hadn't happened yet. The conclusion was obvious. Either Benjamin had turned prophet, and somehow got ahead of the almanac, or he was carrying on, as she likes to say, in some very underhanded manner. Mrs. Quelch decided for the latter alternative and determined to get to the bottom of the matter at once. She cut a sandwich, put on her bonnet, and grasping her umbrella in a manner which boded no good to anyone who stayed her progress, she started by the next train for Liverpool Street. On reaching home, she extracted from the weeping Mrs. Widger, who had just been spending the last of Benjamin's 5 shillings and was far gone in a depression of gin and water, that her good gentleman had not been home since Thursday night. Now, this was bad enough, but there was still more conclusive evidence that he was up to no good in the shape of his tall hat, which hung silent accuser on the last peg in the passage. Having pumped Miss Widger till there was no more save tears to be pumped out of her, Mrs. Quelch, still firmly grasping her umbrella, proceeded next door on the chance that her neighbor, Mrs. Fladgate, might be able to give her some information. She found Mrs. Fladgate weeping in the parlor with an open telegram before her. Being a woman who did not stand upon ceremony, she read the telegram, which was dated from Dieppe, and ran as follows. Monsieur Fladgate here detained for to have smuggled cigars. Fine to pay 100 francs. Send money, and he will be released. Oh, the men. The stupid, poor men, cried Miss Quelch as she dropped into an armchair. They're all alike. First Benjamin, now Fladgate. I shouldn't wonder if they had gone off together. You don't mean to say that Mr. Quelch is gone too? Sobbed Mrs. Fladgate. He's taken a shameful advantage of my absence. He has not been home since Thursday evening, and his hat is hanging up in the hall. You don't think that he's been murdered? No, I'm not afraid of that, replied Mrs. Quelch. It wouldn't be worth anybody's while, now would it? But what has he got on his head? That's what I want to know. Of course, if he's with Mr. Fladgate in some foreign den of iniquity, that accounts for it. Well, don't foreigners wear hats too? Inquired Mrs. Fladgate innocently. Not the respectable English sort, I'll be bound, replied Mrs. Quelch. Some outlandish rubbish, I dare say, but I thought Mr. Fladgate on his Scotch journey. Mr. Fladgate, it should be stated, was a traveller in the oil line. Right, so he is. I mean, so he ought to be. In fact, I expected him home today. But now he's in prison, and I may never see him any more. And Mrs. Fladgate wept afresh. Stuff and nonsense, retorted Mrs. Quelch. You've only to send the money they ask for, and they'll be glad enough to get rid of him. But I wouldn't worry. I'd let him wait a bit. You'll see him soon enough, never fear. Buddy, I need that hand back. I gotta turn the page, okay? Give me a sec. Okay. The prophecy was fulfilled sooner than the prophet expected. Scarcely were the words out of her mouth when a cab was heard to draw up at the door, and a moment later, Fladgate himself, a big, jovial man wearing a white hat very much tilted to one side, entered the room and threw a bundle of rugs on the sofa. "Right home again, old girl, and glad of it. Morning, Mrs. Quelch," said the newcomer. Mrs. Fladgate gazed at him doubtfully for a moment, and then flung her arms around his neck, crying, "Saved! I'm saved!" "Martha," said Mrs. Quelch reprovingly, "have you no self-respect? Is this the way you deal with so shameful a deception?" Then, turning to the supposed offender, "So, Mr. Fladgate, you have escaped from your foreign prison." "Right. Foreign? How much then?" "Have you both gone daft, ladies? I've just escaped from a third-class carriage on the London and the North Western. The space is limited, but I never heard it called a foreign prison." "It is useless to endeavor to deceive us," said Mrs. Quelch sternly. "Look at that telegram, Mr. Fladgate, and deny it if you can. You have been gadding about in some vile foreign place with my misguided husband." "Oh, Quelch is in it too, is he? Then it must be a bad case, but let's see what we have been up for 'pon my word, I am quite in the dark at the present." He held out his hand for the telegram and read it carefully. "Someone's been having a lark with you, old lady," he said to his wife. "You know well enough where I've been. My regular northern journey, and nowhere else." "I don't believe a word of it," said Mrs. Quelch. "You men are all alike, deceivers, every one of you." "Much obliged for your opinion, Mrs. Quelch. I had no idea Mr. Quelch was such a bad lot, but so far as I am concerned, the thing's easily tested. Here's the bill for my bed last night at Carlisle. Now, if I was in Carlisle and larking about at Dieppe at the same time, then perhaps you'll kindly explain how I managed it." Mrs. Quelch was staggered, but not convinced. But if you were at Carlisle, where's Benjamin? And what does this telegram mean? "Not being a wizard, I really can't say, but concerning Mr. Quelch, we shall find him, never fear. When did he disappear?" Mrs. Quelch told her story, not forgetting the mysterious letter. "I think I see the daylight," said Fladgate. "The party who had gotten into that mess is Mr. Quelch, and, being frightened out of his wits, he has given my name instead of his own. That's about the size of it. But Benjamin doesn't smoke, and how should he even come to be at Dieppe?" "He went for a holiday, I suppose. And as for smoking, well, I shouldn't have thought he was up to it. But with that set-upon sort of man, begging your pardon, Mrs. Quelch, you never know where he might break out. Worms will turn, you know, and sometimes they take a wrong turning." "But Benjamin would never dare. That's just it. He daren't do anything when you've got your eye on him. When you haven't, perhaps he may. And perhaps he mayn't. The fact is, you hold up his head too tight, and if he jibs you now and then, well, you can't wonder at it, can you? You have a rather coarse way of putting things, Mr. Fladgate. Mr. Quelch is not a horse. Well, we won't quarrel about the animal, my dear madam, but you may depend upon it, my solution is correct. A hardened villain like myself, say, would never have gotten into such a scrape, but Mr. Quelch, he doesn't know enough of the world to keep himself out of mischief. They got him in the jail, that's clear. And the best thing that you can do for him is just to send the coin and get him out again. Send money. Send money to those swindling Frenchmen. Never. If Benjamin is in prison, I will fetch him out myself. You would never risk that dreadful sea passage, exclaimed Fladgate. Right, and how would you manage the language? You don't understand French, added Mrs. Fladgate. Oh, I shall do very well, said the heroic woman. They will not utter French to me. That same night, a female passenger crossed by the boat from New Haven to Dieppe. The passage was rough and the passenger was very seasick, but she still sat grimly upright, never for one moment relaxing her grasp on the handle of her silk umbrella. What she went through on the landing, how she finally obtained her husband's release, and what explanations passed between the reunited pair must be left up to the listener's imagination, for Mrs. Quelch never told that story. However, 24 hours later, a cab drew up at the Quelch's door, and from it descended, first, a stately female, and then a woe-begone little man in a soft felt hat and red necktie, both sorely crushed and soiled, with a black bag in his little hand. Is there a fire in the kitchen? Asked Mrs. Quelch the moment she set foot in the house. Being assured that there was, she proceeded down the kitchen stairs. Quelch meekly followed her. Now, she said, pointing to the black bag, those things. Benjamin opened the bag and tremblingly took out the frilly nightdress and the cigars. His wife pointed to the fire, and he meekly laid them on it. Now, that necktie, the necktie followed the cigars, and that thing, and the hat crowned the funeral pyre. The smell was peculiar, and to the ordinary nose disagreeable, but to Mrs. Quelch it was as the odor of burnt incense. She watched the heap as it smoldered away and finally dispersed by the embers by a vigorous application of the poker. Now, Benjamin, she said to her trembling spouse, I forgive you, but if you ever again. The warning was left unspoken, but it was not needed. Benjamin's one experience has more than satisfied his yearning for soft apparel and foreign travel. And his hats are taller than ever. Did you like that one, buddy? There were no non-human people in it, but he dug it. Oh, I see there's an inquiry in the chat as to whether or not my braid still remains, and yes, it does. Well, that was fun. I hope you all enjoyed listening to that as much as I enjoyed reading it. That was, yeah, that was fun. And, just because I'm feeling spontaneous and, yeah, I'm going to just plunge right in and go for it. I'm going to sign off on this cast now. And I am going to join the Vaudacity Network Zoom. So log back in and flip over to Vaudacity for Moody Monday, beginning in 22 minutes. And yeah, so the next Fireside Tales with Wolfgang will be 2 weeks from now. So mark your calendars and go out and have a memorable Memorial Day next week. And yeah, and until I see you all again in 21 minutes, have a good evening. Thank you for